Welcome to this episode of the Heartbeat for Hire podcast. I feature Olympians, CEOs, disruptors, authors, professional athletes, and the best of the best, where they share their stories of resilience with my lens on leadership and culture. Let's get started. Greetings and welcome to this episode of the Heartbeat for Hire podcast. 3 things you will learn from this episode. Number 1, why stories make you memorable. Number 2, what atomic storytelling is. And number 3, what elements go into a great pitch deck. Please welcome my friend Chris Hare to the show. Chris is a keynote speaker, master storyteller, and an Amazon and Microsoft veteran. He's the founder of the Storied Future and holds the Storied Future podcast. Hosts the Storied Future podcast. When he's not keynoting, podcasting, or building pitch decks, Chris can be found leading therapeutic storytelling for a fly fishing nonprofit that serves combat wounded veterans. I mean, could that be any cooler? Welcome to the show, Chris.
Thanks, Lyndsay. I've been looking forward to this.
Me too. I love a good story, and that is where we'll get started. So could you please share a little bit of yours?
Yeah, absolutely. So my background, I started in advertising and marketing, worked at Amazon, Microsoft, started my company in 2016, and something pretty magical happened around 2023. I started my own podcast, and I thought I had in mind where that was going to take me. It was brand building, biz
Yeah.
dev, but I would have leaders on who would tell these unreal stories that they'd never told before. And I had the CEO of Logitech on. They ended up making it part of employee onboarding at the company. Another person used it to turn around, lead a remarkable turnaround. Thing after thing like that kept happening. And that's when I finally realized like my gift and also my passion is creating a space where people tell the story they've never told before in a
Mm.
way that increases their effectiveness, but also transforms them. So that's
Mm.
what I'm all about.
I love that. And I mean, that's the whole reason this show exists is to tell stories and inspire great leaders, or inspire people to be great leaders. So talk a little bit about what does the Storied Future do? What's the focus? How do you work with your clients?
Yeah, absolutely. So there's two areas where I focus on is one is companies that are going through a transformation, a transition, or a transaction. And all of a sudden you have a new strategy, a new future that you're trying to take everyone towards. And so it's how do you translate? What I do is translate the business strategy into a narrative that aligns board to buyer around that same future. So,
Love
but
that.
it's not just oftentimes the brand narrative is kind of owned by the CMO and kept in this separate bucket, but it really in my experience, really needs to be owned by the CEO. And it's really, 50% of it is internal, right? How do you get
Yeah.
everyone running internally towards that same goal? So that's part of what I do. And that comes through workshops, through consulting, things like that. And then the other side is I'm a coach, executive coach for midlife executives who are trying to unlock what's next.
Yeah.
So they'll come to me for executive brand. How do I find that authentic narrative? And they get that. But the bonus, and that's kind of a Trojan horse for me a little bit, the bonus and the thing I care most about is how hearing your story transforms you.
Yeah.
And so there's a lot of rewriting internal narratives, but that are then can be manifested externally through their executive brand and through company they start, through the nonprofit work they do, whatever that is.
Yeah, I love that you said that. And to me, I mean, that's kind of how I screen my guests. So, when we have a chemistry chat, the first question I always ask is, tell me your story. And if they can do it well and we have good banter, they're likely going to end up being a guest. But every once in a while, I come across someone and they'll be like, well, I guess I'll start in fourth grade. And you're like, oh no, they are out of practice. And I actually had a guy, I asked him that question. And he went on for about 8 minutes, and I still have no idea what he said. And I stopped him and I said, hey, listen, I think there's a really good story buried in there, but you've got to get a lot better at telling it. And I'm going to challenge you to go and work on it. And, here are some elements that I think really made sense. And I would highlight that. And he goes, I accept this challenge. And he went off and he recorded a whole bunch of them, sent them to me. And I'm like, you passed. You can be a
That's
guest. This
awesome.
is good. But it's so important for people to be thinking about their story as they're thinking about their brand, as they're thinking about interviewing, as they're thinking about pitching. It's just so much more memorable than a bunch of statistics and numbers. So, can we talk a little bit about why stories, at least in our mind, work better than just rattling off statistics and other mumbo jumbo?
Yeah, it's interesting. There's a professor at Princeton who's actually, done MRIs of people's brains when you're reciting facts versus when you're telling stories.
Oh my
And so
God.
much of your brain, so much more of your brain lights up, but our brains also sync when we're telling stories. Um, I mean, there's so many reasons, right? It's not just, I think where we sell ourselves short with storytelling and business storytelling is um, that we focus just on the transactional. Like how does the story get me in the room, get me the deal, get me the job,
Yeah.
get me the raise? And there's nothing wrong with that, but we miss the whole two more levels, which is how does storytelling help us build an organization, build a culture, build a career, all of those things, build a team. And then the next level is how does it enable us to become like
Mm,
who we want to become, to manifest our purpose, etc. And so I think that's one area that we often miss, but also I think what you alluded to, or in the story you shared about that gentleman that you coached
mhm.
is generally with storytelling, we go to the end, we go to the structure, right?
Yeah.
So a lot of people would tell that guy, well, here's how you need to structure it differently, right? And you need to use the hero's journey or this other framework or whatever. But we often, in my opinion, the biggest challenge we have is actually an inputs challenge. How do we find what the raw material of the story
I
that we should
agree.
even be telling in the
I
first place?
agree.
And most of us can't, most people, a lot, not everyone, but most people struggle to find what those really transformational stories are. And
Yeah.
we have to use both tools and or frameworks and then other people to uncover those.
I totally agree with that. And that's one of the things that we teach in a lot of the work that we do with Entry. What is your unique value prop and what's your why? And a lot of people, you're right, have a hard time figuring out what is their why. I'm in software sales. Why am I, what do you mean? What's my why? My why is to get a paycheck. But actually, there's usually something underneath that we can pull out, and it does make a far more compelling story. So, what is atomic storytelling?
Yeah, so I teased it a little bit there, but the genesis of it is when I started working in an ad agency back in 2010, I would work on these things that were like really pretty technical products and that I didn't know anything about. So I just went and created content with the people who either built it or the people who like influenced the audience. And I just did that over time. And eventually what I realized is the whole model within marketing, and then I think this extends across all of business, but is like, hey, we hire some really smart people for the marketing team, and then we bring in a really smart agency and we all get in a room and we figure out this thing. And we may have data, we may have research, and people always say that they do. But what ends up happening is it's so far distant, you get further and further and further away from the customer and the people who influence them. And so it's this idea of like, okay, we have something we're a business, we have something that we need to sell, and we may have the research, but let's just go and sit and talk to people, walk in their shoes, be in their world and ask them about what lights them up, what keeps them awake at night, and pull out their stories. And so the idea where it came from was this rather than let's come up with this really big idea, let's go and find these really small stories that together have the energy and matter we need to shape into a
Yeah.
narrative, messaging, content, etc. And I've since found there's a professor at Ohio State University's narrative project, Angus Fletcher, and his work, and since I've moved into the therapeutic storytelling and leadership storytelling, his work speaks to this idea that when we uncover plot twists from across our journey, so if we can find a way to access those stories that we've forgotten about or that we don't think important, but we find those plot twists that unlock joy, pride,
Mm,
etc., or even negative emotions, that we can use that to shape a new future. So that's kind of the genesis of it is like it's the raw material
yeah.
and that's why I separate story and narrative. They can be the same thing, but I find it's really helpful to think about, okay, atomic stories, um, that's the raw material, and then we shape that into the
Mm,
narrative. So
love that. And you hit on therapeutic storytelling. What is that?
Yeah, so around 2018, I had a significant mental health challenge that I encountered. And part of the healing process for me was fly fishing. So in 2018, I started working with this veterans organization. We reunite combat wounded veterans with their units, take them fly fishing.
Mm,
And there's mental health coaching. And I was doing the storytelling and the brand for the organization. But what was interesting and what I came to realize over time, and then I think everyone started to realize eventually, was that what happens when you create a space where people can explore their journey and tell the stories they've never told before, right?
yeah.
And so seeing like last year we had this unit who came to celebrate this Marine who had given his life, and the general who gave the order for him to go out on that patrol was there.
Mm,
His buddies who were there and saw it happen and were recounting it, and one of the guys said, um I've talked about him in speeches and things, but I've never really told the story until now, and it's
yeah.
been almost 20 years, right?
Wow.
And then another guy talking about this idea of like, hey, the hardest part is that he's frozen in time. He will always be 21.
Right.
And we've all gone on. We all have families. We all have kids. We all, have these experiences that he'll never have.
Mm-mm.
And so it's really creating a space where people can interact with their journey and their stories, and then also asking the kind of questions that can, and being a safe person that can pull that out
Yeah.
so that they can kind of unlock those atomic stories that can bring about healing. I think one of the most compelling ones that I've seen was, there was a group of Marines that, you know, lost a lot of their brothers, and a number of them, one of the guys who came out had lost both legs, lost his eyes. His tagline, he has a great sense of humor. His tagline was no leg, no vision, no problem. But they came out, and one of the Marines that was there, the corpsman who saved their lives, was at the airport and almost didn't come.
Mm,
And then another Marine almost didn't come because he's like, I haven't talked to these guys in 13 years because I believe that they were so much better Marines than me.
mm-hmm.
And he said what happened. So that was his narrative. And that narrative was fed by stories that he was telling himself
Sure.
all those years. And he got there and he said on camera, he said within an instant, it was completely gone. Like that narrative
Um,
instantly shifted, right? So some of it is not just what are the stories we tell, but also what are the stories that we create
Tell
space so that
ourselves.
those stories can happen as well,
Yeah,
right? Because
yeah.
those are stories happening in real time.
Well, and it just goes to show you that, nobody is immune from telling yourself bad stories and creating bad narratives in your head. So get out of your head. Talk to the
Yeah.
people you think that there's something going on, because chances are you're not right.
Yeah.
Um, so I love that you do that work. It's so, so important. So thank you for that. And I know you're about to go off on another fly fishing trip with a whole bunch of Marines. Is that right?
No, this is actually a group of leaders.
Oh,
So
leaders.
yeah, I've
Excellent.
started these experiences where we're starting to take CEOs and other leaders, bring them together to build community, fly fish where they can get away from it all, and then also do storytelling.
Amazing. I think there's so much to be gained through that. And I mean, when you think back to history and Native Americans, that's how they passed on history. It was through stories, and everyone remembers stories. So I love that you do that. So while you're not telling stories, you also work on pitch decks. So what goes into a solid pitch deck?
Yeah, so the pitch decks I've worked on historically, I mean, I've worked with, startups to unicorns to, big enterprise companies. And where I'm typically focused, and I have worked, I did one that was, and this was actually one of the coolest outcomes, was I built a narrative for this pre-revenue um, startup. It was waste to energy, and the the founder was just like had this huge crazy vision, and he would just lose people because it was like 100-year vision, and he would just lose people, right? And so I had a month to build the narrative and then build the pitch deck. And so built it, in the corporate venture capital scout at this Fortune 50 actually connected later and said, I need to meet whoever wrote this narrative because he gets hundreds of pitches a week. And he's like, this one just, popped above the top. So that was really cool. But what I would say the elements that are most important is one, have an like, and again, I'm biased, but have an atomic story. So
Yeah.
what he did in that instance is if you think about plastic and plastic waste, the companies that manufacture it can't see downstream. And so they have no idea where the plastic is. I mean, they do in theory, but they can't track it, and then they have no way to recapture it. And so what most people would think about is like, hey, if we're going to build a pitch deck, we talk about, you know, our process or our technology or all
Yeah.
of these things. But what we ended up uncovering was there was, the founder, his parents and his family owned a soda distributor.
Hmm.
And so they had a guy who was delivering soda to restaurants. And one day someone at a restaurant said, "Hey, can I buy a pallet of toilet paper?"
Hmm.
Like you would think this story had zero relevance to a waste to energy story, right? And the guy says, "Sure." So he buys it on his own credit card without permission, ends up getting reimbursed, sells it to him. But what happened in that moment is he unlocked a number of things. One, discretionary spend. A restaurant has, I think it's like 55 cents of discretionary spend. Only 5 cents of that is put towards soda.
Hmm.
And so there's like 250 SKUs they could sell. Well, now there was a 9x revenue potential that opened up and 250,000 SKUs. But what it also meant is now there's a potential, instead of sending these trucks out partly full with soda, you can now actually fill them up. And now there's more money in the system where they can actually recapture the plastic and incentivize people at the end of the chain to send it back up, right?
Mm.
But there was also this really compelling human story as well, because this driver had retired and with the economic crash lost all of his retirement,
Mm.
and the system didn't help him. So it's this new system that's being created could actually have helped him, right?
Mm.
So it's having that story that people can either see themselves in or feel, right? So it's not just the rational, but it's that thing that people can feel. Um, and then where I always focus is, if I come to you and I say, "Hey, Lyndsay, here's these," I'm not going to say this overtly, but what it often said is, "Here's these pain points you have, or here are these problems that you have, and here's how we're going to solve them." Right. But it's very much like, let's actually start from what's the differentiated future that we're creating with our customers and all of our stakeholders that only we can create together,
Mm.
right? Or that we can own. So let's define what that future looks like, and then let's talk about um, what what the shift is that's going on in the world right now that is going to lead to people winning and losing. There's a ton of different ways that you can go, but there's a great article years ago called I think it's the greatest sales deck ever by Andy Raskin, and he's evaluating a pitch deck, and I've used this quite a bit, but what it focuses on is, here's the future, and then here's this shift that's happened that's causing a choice, and then that choice is going to cause winners and losers, and you share examples of that, but then here's the steps to get to that future. But rather than starting with, "Hey, here's what you're doing wrong," or "Here's how we can change things with you,"
Yeah.
it's really starting with that future.
Mm. Smart. I love that. I can see why your pitch decks are well received. So shifting gears a little bit, what inspires you?
So I'll tell you what my narrative is. And this, I mean, this is what inspires me, is it's really creating a future where leaders are celebrated, not just for what they built, but for how they built it, who they took with them, and who they became in the process. Because, I heard someone say once that your passion, going back to the Latin root word for passion, is suffering. Like, what's the thing you believe in so much that you're willing to suffer for it? And
Mm.
so I've been in organizations where I and a lot of other people suffered because people were so obsessed um, with effectiveness, but didn't value humans. And so, like, hey, it's actually possible. There's a great article in HBR called "The Leadership Odyssey," and the research shows that it's more and more, you can't just be effective; you have to blend it with human-centered skills if not values, right? So
We
that's the
talk
thing
about
that,
that a lot here.
yeah. So that's the thing that lights me up is how can you actually use your narrative as a
Yeah.
leader and rewrite your narrative to make that future possible?
Well, and what that all is connection with people. And when you can tell a story that shows that you're an authentic human, that you're flawed, that you've grown, you've learned from some adverse circumstance, people connect with that. And it's not hard math, but it is hard for a lot of people to do. And I think people mistake leadership with okay, I'm leading this team, I better really look like I know what I'm doing, and I better be perfect at it. And I think that's a really big mistake. Nobody knows everything, and you couldn't be expected to know everything going into a new job. So you've got to say, okay, guys, you've been here longer than me. What do I need to know? Tell me who's who in the zoo. What do I have to watch? What are the politics? And earn some trust. And then you can start slotting people into things that are their strengths. But yeah, you shouldn't go in saying you know everything ever.
Yeah, I think too, when you talked about why stories make us memorable, I've, shared with clients before is like what we often think are the things that make us memorable is like, where do we do our undergrad? Where do we get our MBA? What are the companies we look for? And it's just go on LinkedIn and look up everyone who has those things. And it's just a sea of faces and you
Yep.
don't stand out
Nope.
at all,
Yeah.
right? But it's those stories that demonstrate that,
Yeah.
but also that enable the goal is not to connect with everyone, right? But your story is going to connect with the right people who are
That's right.
aligned with the future that you want.
That's right. I love that. What would you like your legacy to be?
Ooh, that's a great question. I mean, the words that come to mind is um, Chris is a kind human being who helped me find and live out my purpose
Mm,
more, I would say. Yeah, I think that's it.
Congratulations, because you're already doing it. So good
Well,
job.
thank you. Yeah,
Um,
I had a client call last week, and that was one of the highlights of my week is someone who went from miserable, I want to sell my company, I want a new narrative, to this overnight transformation to being happy and content and called me last week and it's like, I finally found my purpose and it's helping other people be happy rather than chasing the next shiny object. Like
Love
that
that.
for me, that brings me so much joy.
Oh, that's fantastic. So what's next for Chris?
Yeah, so um we'll see. I'm not putting a ton of eggs in this basket, but we'll see what happens. I've built we actually have a working demo right now of an AI storytelling coach. So I'm partnering with an AI learning and development platform company. And, you know, obviously, a lot of training is not measurable in the enterprise. And so this actually takes atomic storytelling coupled with a curriculum and actually coaches people, not, like ChatGPT writes a
Hmm.
story for you.
Yeah,
It coaches you against the rubric and pulls you out. It solves the inputs problem
I
with
love
through
it.
all different scenarios, right? And pulls that out and then helps you grow over time. So
Yeah,
I think that's a piece of it, but really it's the kind of growing that midlife leader practice is what I'm most excited about, the purpose over 50 piece.
I love it. And how can people find you?
Yeah, so LinkedIn, I'm at Hareforce1, HAREFORCE numeral one. And then my website is thestoriedfuture.com. And yeah, those are the two best ways to get me.
I love it. Well, guys, if you're not connected with Chris, go follow him on LinkedIn, connect with him, tell him I sent you. And if you liked what you heard, please tell your friends, subscribe to the YouTube channel, write a 5-star review at Apple or Spotify. They are so meaningful in growing the show. We are booked well into next year, or not next year, we're well into this year, all the way up till I think the end of June. So lots of great guests coming your way. And I hope you found this valuable. Chris, you were a pleasure. Thanks for being on. And thanks for telling your stories.
Yeah, thanks so much for having me on. You're a phenomenal interviewer. This is a great way to get the day rolling.
Oh, I appreciate that so much. Thanks, everybody. I hope you had a great day and enjoyed the episode. Take care of each other and go lead with heart. Are you ready to elevate your leadership style and create an exceptional workplace that stands out from the crowd? I'm here to introduce you to a game-changing resource that will transform the way you lead and shape your company culture. It's time to embrace the power of top-down culture. This practical guide empowers your leadership for lasting success, helping you create a workplace where everyone thrives. Get top-down culture today, and let's reshape the future of leadership together. Thanks for listening to this episode of Heartbeat for Hire. I hope you enjoyed what you heard. If you did, please subscribe to my YouTube channel or consider leaving a 5-star review and a great rating at Spotify or Apple. Thank you so much for your support. Have a great day.